Good morning, Brooke. This is Sandy. We don't have LazBuddy in the 8 o'clock class anymore. So we don't need them up on the screen. You might tell the region, I don't know if they know or not. Anybody try doing any of those readings yet?
I started it yesterday.
Actually, it's kind of tough to read in particular. I'll give you a hint. Walter Raleigh is spelled R-A-G-H-L-Y. That's who he's talking about. Who's this Ragley guy? Hello, hello.
Hi.
That looks like Hale Cinder. Everybody look in your chairs. I was over there the other day. I may have booby trapped something. Hale Cinder, since I've got you right now, do you guys have a history class that alternates with my class? In other words, do you go into a history class on Tuesdays and Thursdays?
I don't know what the volume situation is, but he should be able to hear us.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. I think our sound into Hoka is finally working.
Oh, okay. That's the Hoka talking right now, too. And question for Hale Cinder. The question for Hale Cinder is, do you guys have the same class period on Tuesdays and Thursdays? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, okay, then it makes it easy for me to show up and visit. Okay. So Hoka, I can't see you. Try pushing that talk button again. I can hear you, but I can't see you.
Can you see us?
I still can't see you. I'll call Brooke and get her to fix that. Oh, she got it. Good morning, Brooke. Thank you. We don't have LazBuddy anymore. Could you just put me up there so I can see that I'm still alive? I can be the fourth picture on the screen. I think you can do that. That way I know I haven't done something really silly, like come in with my jacket on backwards or something. People that do things like this always have a mirror in their office before they go out the door. Otherwise, you can make terrible mistakes. Okay. We kind of got a general feeling for what was going on in Europe and that sort of thing last time around. We talked about some of the things such as trade, worldwide trade going on, and the fact that as we approach the period of time that we're really going to study, there was kind of a roadblock to going to China overland because of the Ottoman Empire. And there's going to be another roadblock pretty soon, and we'll talk about that today. But I thought maybe we'd look at the PowerPoints a little bit This is the PowerPoint, I think it's European Conquest, the name of it, you've got it anyway. Let me see if I can get it to pop up on the screen. There it is. That's the world. In fact, that's the Atlantic community, except it kind of chops off a lot of Europe. I assume by now that everybody can tell me, someone, if you could actually get your finger over here, you could point at the Iberian Peninsula. Can anybody in this room point at the Iberian Peninsula? Lot A, right there. And nowadays, in the modern world, Spain and Portugal dominate that peninsula. Okay. And we talked about, whoa, there's some information we don't want to see yet. We talked about the fact that the Spanish and the Portuguese were busy driving the Moors off of the Iberian Peninsula for almost 800 years, 700 some odd years. They didn't get done until 1492. But the Portuguese were kind of done way back in the 1300s with their part of the deal. Ferdinand and Isabella, the King of Aragon and the Queen of Castile, were busy trying to finish the job. And they'll finish it with Granada in 1492. But let's take a look at what Mr. Hunt has hidden up here. History defined. This could show up on an exam. I won't ask you to give me the definition, but I may show you the definition and ask you what is the definition of. An orderly and systematic study of human activities in the past. It's not the only job a historian has to do, though. First, he's got to find the information. Then he's got to make sure it's not a bunch of you-know-what, that it's really accurate. Then he's got to figure out if it's really significant. And then he has to organize it in such a way that people can get it back, can get to it. You can have all this knowledge stacked up in the corner of a room, and if nobody can get to it, it's worthless. No matter how many years you've worked on it. I mentioned to you last time that I used to work in an intelligence agency. We had that problem. We had really good guys that could dig up all sorts of stuff, and then nobody could get to it, so you couldn't use it. And I shocked the deputy director of that agency by telling him that in front of a large crowd. And he wasn't, of course, because he was a pretty big guy, he wasn't intimidated at all, and the whole crowd went, woo! They said, you're about to lose your job. And he pointed at me and said, give me details, and I told him where I saw a whole bunch of this stuff stacked. And he gave me the job of unmessing up the mess, which earned me another about $8,000 that year. So that's part of the deal. When we're historians or studying it, we have to make it available to other people. There's some historical fallacies. Don't write this down. Just listen to me. One of them is a word I mentioned to you last time. I would like you to know this word, anachronism. And that's where you take something that's that belongs to one time period and you stick it in another time period, such as reasoning. I think the best example is if we're talking about the subject of slavery right now. You and I all know about slavery. We know that it's a bad thing and all of that. If you go back to sometime in the 1400s, the Pope said slavery was okay. So when you're talking about what people were thinking and doing in that time, you have to understand the context of the situation. See what I'm getting at? So you can't judge them by what you know now. You have to judge them by what they knew then to be historically accurate. So you can often, for example, every time I talk about Ferdinand and Isabella as being the king and queen of Spain, that's an anachronism because Spain didn't exist while they were king and queen. There was two countries. He owned one, she owned one, until she died, until they had a kid. When she died and then he died, their daughter, Joanna the Mad, took over for a while until people decided she was just too wacky to be queen. And then her son took over. We don't need to worry about that. Another thing is nostalgia. That's a fallacy in history. When you always say, oh, the good old days. Write this down. This is a lesson in life. It has nothing to do with history in particular. There is no such thing as the good old days. Come on, you know. Oh, I want to live when there was open range, where I could ride my horse and no barbed wire, and it was wonderful back then. And I could probably die if I got a cold. If I cut myself on something, I might die of tetanus. I don't like that. There's no such thing as the good old days. There's different times, there's no question. There's another fallacy. If it's printed, it's true. Believe it or not, there's a lot of people that think that, or they feel that way. And it doesn't matter if it's printed or not. It doesn't even matter if it's your textbook or not. You better find out if there's any real facts to support it. I mean, all you have to do is, I hate to mention Wally World, all you have to do is get in line at Walmart to pay and look at the magazine rack on your left-hand side, and it will say things like, John F. Kennedy is still really alive, living on a Greek island, and all sorts of stuff like that. Come on, you've seen, you see all of it. Anyway, or, Hillary Clinton's actually the Pope's illegitimate daughter and things like that. Go figure. So if it's printed, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. They also say history repeats itself. Now, this is a little tricky. There's a guy named, and I think I got a picture of him down here. There he is. You can forget him as soon as I turn the slide off. His name is Gian Battista Vico, and he was one of the earliest people that was formally a historian, also studied law and languages and things. But he said history can't repeat itself. It's like a spiral. You come back to similar times, but everything around it, the context, has changed. So nothing can be exactly the same as it was before. That doesn't mean that there aren't similarities. I kind of like his idea, and besides that, it's kind of confusing, so it's fun. Hindsight is 20/20. I don't know, there's a famous man, and he's a good man and a good writer, who just wrote a book about the wonderful years during the Second World War. How we were all united and all of that. Sorry, that's baloney. We weren't all united. There were people screaming against going and fighting the war. There were people in favor of the Russians. There were people in favor of the Nazis. Well, we were pretty united. But the fact is, looking back at it doesn't make you the expert. And the last one comes from a saying that a lot of people misquote. And the saying is, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That's not what the man said. What the man said, and you really have to think about it to notice the difference, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And there was a fellow, he's an American, had dual citizenship, American-Spanish guy named George Santa Anna, a brilliant man. Said a lot of other interesting things. Okay, what we're going to talk about now is what I call participants in the Mr. Director, I was talking about slides that they couldn't see. You got to point your finger at the screen and say, you're not showing the slide. We're going to talk about participants in the Great Collision. What I'm talking about is all the different kinds of people that came together with the eventual result that we're going to have a country or two or three over here. Not just the United States. Let's look at the Americas first. That's a great slide, moving right on. There's a timeline. You can go back and look at that anytime you want. Before Christopher, that's what pre-Columbian means, by the way. Before Christopher Columbus showed up, people had already been scattered over the northern and southern Americas. Really couldn't say that they were Native Americans because they came from somewhere else. They got here and they spread out over North America, and I think probably first North America and then South America, but don't hold me to that. I don't think anyone absolutely knows for a fact. And they started out as hunter-gatherers, people that had to keep moving because if they grew out of the ground or was on a tree, you could pick it. If you could eat it, you could eat it. And you had to kill things. And after a while, if you weren't raising it yourself, you ran out of it in an area, you had to move to another area. A lot of people think that things like the giant bison, another extinct species, may have been actually killed off by hunter-gatherers. Other people think they were killed off by a cold spell. Eventually, they're going to develop into people who farm. In the Americas, about 5,000 years before BC, we say, or now we say before the Common Era, BCE, people started figuring out that they could make stuff grow out of the ground, seeds of things that they like to eat. They also probably domesticated animals. Probably the first animals domesticated were dogs, both as they were pets. They were either edible, you could either eat them or you could use them for something. Eventually we'll get, like Americans are. My wife's Vietnamese. She does not understand the relationship between Americans and their pets. To her, a dog was something that ran around outside your house and you threw food out to them if you hadn't have some on the table. Took her a long time to get used to that. In fact, when we came to America and we went into the first supermarket she'd ever seen in her life, I told her for years that, Americans do not eat dog. She goes into, I think it was a United, and happens to walk down the row and sees a can of kennel ration, and there's a picture of dog in it. And she goes, "Ah! You said Americans don't eat dog." And I said, "Sweetheart, that's food for dogs, not dog meat." But anyway, people all develop at different rates. Probably the first people came here in maybe 20,000 years ago, maybe 25,000 years ago, maybe even more. By 14,000 years ago, they'd reached all the way down to the southern tip of South America. For one reason or another, they were pretty much disease-free, probably because of the different places that they came from. Now, you're going to hear about Beringia, the theory of how people got into North America. And the theory is that they came across either a landmass or an ice bridge in between Asia and North America. Up there where the Bering Strait is, it's a pretty narrow body of water. And you can imagine hunter-gatherers and people like that wandering across that. I want to point out to you that that's what most people believe, but it's a theory. And in fact, about 3 weeks ago, we have DNA now, a fellow, an American Indian, had DNA research, and in his genes were genes of people from Polynesia. Because years ago there was also a theory that some people floated across the Pacific in rafts. Some fellows tried to prove it and they couldn't prove it, so they kind of gave up on the theory. So this Beringia thing is a theory. It's a pretty strong theory. And the reason that I say it's pretty strong, you can study history, even though there's no written history, by how language develops and who speaks what families of languages where. And you'll find connections between different geographic locations because of the language families they speak. Also, maybe things like tools that they use and pottery that they use and things like that. So we put our history together. Originally, when historians would only go back as far as man wrote things down. But nowadays we use archaeology, even tradition. You listen to the tradition and try and extract the truth out of, like, stories about origin. Where did we come from? That sort of thing. There's the Beringia route. There was lots of meat available. There were animals running all over the place. But eventually, they overhunt. We think that climate changes and things like that may have caused some of these varieties of animals to die out. We don't know for sure. About 5,000 years ago, as I told you, they started domesticating some simple crops. And they're going to get into raising maize, squash, beans. And they're going to start shifting from purely being nomads into being, some of the people will settle around where they're growing their crops. Some of them didn't. Some of them planted crops and kept on moving and came back and got what they could get. They didn't do a cultivation or anything. They just left it there and came back. There's one of the first crops that they grew. It's called teosinte, down in an area called Mesoamerica, and I'll point that out to you in a minute. It's kind of an ancestor of corn, although in the Americas they didn't have corn until Europeans showed up, but they had maize. Believe it or not, they're that separate. We'll talk about the exchange of different kinds of plant life in between the different continents as we go along. We can skip a whole lot of things. This part of the map, kind of the connection part between North and South America, some people call Central America. It's not really a continent or anything, so it really doesn't get to be called that officially, but it's called Mesoamerica by geography. It's not a place, there's no borders or anything, but it starts from somewhere in the southern part of what is now Mexico and runs down to where the Isthmus of Panama connects North America to South America. And some of the most complex native life and the biggest cities and things like that and the largest assemblies of people developed there first. In fact, there's one chart you can look at. Down in Mesoamerica, one of the earliest groups were called the Olmecs. The general characteristics of them, they were polytheistic. They developed a math system. I think they didn't use, our math is based on the unit 10, right? I think theirs was based on 20. Go figure. They used irrigation. They domesticated dogs. Some of the places that concentrations of people that developed in Mesoamerica on this map. Another group of people that were probably just as old as the Olmecs, but totally separate with the Mayans. They were down concentrated on the Yucatan Peninsula. Now, when you guys in dual credit history, or I don't know about you folks in here, but at some stage in your academic life suddenly decide it's time to go off somewhere neat in spring break, the Yucatan Peninsula is quite popular. It also has the traces of the Mayan civilization there. You see one, I think that's Chichen Itza. Built big temples, probably did human sacrifices, hacked cities out of the jungle down in that area. It was pretty much covered with jungle. Their civilization is going to kind of start weakening somewhere around, well, at least before Columbus, and maybe even a little bit earlier than that. But it hung on until the Spanish got there. The remnants of them were still there. That large city-state, a common religion, they considered their ruler to be divine, human sacrifice I mentioned, pyramid temples, and they developed writing Somebody read that slide and pronounce that. Logosyllabic script and hieroglyphic writing. And they cultivated beans, squash, maize, chili peppers, things of that nature. There it is. It's partly symbolic. It's partly symbols. Okay. Now after the Olmecs, you've got a group of people who we'll call the Mexicas, and I'm not sure how well defined they were. And eventually we'll start calling them the Aztecs. And around the 1200s, they become a pretty solidified group. And they're pretty aggressive. And before long, they dominate the majority of Mesoamerica. And their capital city is a place called Tenochtitlan. And it was founded in a lake. I guess that was a defensive thing. And there were causeways from the shore to this city. And they raised a lot of their food on floating gardens. They put soil on reed rafts and float them in this shallow lake. Main thing, they were very aggressive and very domineering. 1372, Tenochtitlan was established. 1428, they controlled all of the Valley of Mexico. By the way, somebody tell me what's on top of where Tenochtitlan was. Anybody? Can anybody guess? Say it. You got it right. Say it loud enough for everyone to hear it. Say it one more time.
Mexico City.
Mexico City. You wonder why Mexico City, the air never moves off of it and all that? It's in a kind of a depression. That's why they have pollution trouble and all that, because the winds don't clean the air out a lot down there. Probably the most famous two kings are the ones that we call Montezuma. That's actually Montezuma. Montezuma the first became the leader of the Mexica people in 1440. They spoke a language called Nahuatl. And all the people in the region, most of the people in the region spoke the same language. Now, because they were a dominant power and because they dominated by force and terror and things like that, no matter how strong you are, if you're dominant like that, you're surrounded by enemies because not everybody likes you. And that will be a point further on down the line to remember. Down south of that, you get the Andean region, running from modern-day Peru down to Chile and South America, and you get the Incas. And they probably had the largest civilization mainly up in the mountainous areas. Very, very, very civilized. Capital was in Cusco. They covered their empire covered where Peru is, or at least parts of western Ecuador, western and south central Bolivia, northwest Argentina and Chile. So they were really spread out. Their king was called the Zapa Inca. They considered him to be the son of the sun. They did a lot of monumental architecture, and they had a really big road network. They practiced slavery. The Aztecs did too, as far as that goes. They made pretty good textiles. They had no iron, and really more important, they had no wheels. So as good as their roads were, they had no beasts of burden either, except for one animal. And you see some of them on farms around here, usually just for fun because nobody uses them for anything useful. Anybody know what they are? They're like mini camels.
Like a donkey?
They didn't have donkeys.
A mule?
They didn't have any horse animals, any equines at all.
A llama?
Llamas, yeah, llama. Incredible. They also had a good communication system. They had runners or messengers that went on all these trails. And their roads, although they were well mapped out and all that, they went up high and they dropped down low because most of their territory was strictly mountainous. And they had something Here, remember this, it's just one little word on this thing. They had something called the Mita, M-I-T-A. You might want to write that down. The Mita was a labor tax. Because you see, they were mining things, and in order to get people to work in the mines, villages were told, you owe us so many days of labor in the mines. But they rotated it so the villagers wouldn't starve because they couldn't raise crops. When the Spanish show up later on and they take over things, they're going to do the same thing. Now up in North America, out in the Southwest, out kind of close to where we are now, you had some fairly well-developed cultures, not anywhere near as big as the Aztecs or the Incas, those people. The Aztecs in Tenochtitlan had a population of about 150,000 people. Let's compare that with modern Europe over there at the time. They had cities with populations, they're big cities, 30,000, 20,000. Guess what? The Aztecs had sewer systems. The Europeans had little potties overnight, and in the morning they just opened the window and poured out the window onto the street. You didn't want to jog down the street in Europe. The Hohokams, the Magalians, and the Anasazi were three groupings of people. If you go from the west to the east, the Hohokams look down where Gila in Arizona is, Casa Grande, places like that. They tended to live in pit houses. They had irrigation. They had their own distinctive form of pottery. The Anasazis, I got to tell you about the word Anasazi. Nowadays, politically correct people call the Anasazi the ancient Puebloan culture. And the reason being is that when people, Americans, anthropologists were going out there and digging up things, looking for the remains of these ancient people, their guides were Navajos. And when they asked the Navajos, well, who do you think these people were? They told them they were the Anasazis. Well, the Pueblo people who are descended from the Anasazis don't like that because the word Anasazi in Navajo means ancient enemy. So now we started calling the Anasazis the ancient Puebloan culture. They were a little bit further north. You can see on that map, there are traces of them, Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon. They also, some of them lived in pit houses and things like that, but a lot of them lived in cliff dwellings and pueblos. In fact, straight out of the Spanish there. There's arguments about whether or not the Anasazi just became totally extinct or whether they just spread out and ended up being the Zunis and the Pueblos of modern times. Generally speaking, historians think that the Anasazis, the Hohokams, and the Mongolians that we'll talk about in a minute all kind of became extinct before Christopher Columbus ever reached the Americas. And nobody can explain exactly why. Maybe climate, maybe disease, probably climate, considering where they lived. Down the furthest south of all these are the Mongolians. Let me see if I can, there's Mesa Verde, by the way. That's built by the ancient Puebloan culture. The Hohokams got there, we already talked about them. The Mongolians were down in what is now southern New Mexico, Arizona, the northern Sonora of Mexico, Chihuahua area, western Texas even, some of them. They also had their own distinctive kind of pottery. A lot of the pottery had different colors depending on where you lived because they used different minerals as part of the substance that they made the pottery from. And that's how archaeologists can figure out, hey, these were Hohokams, they weren't Anasazis, or they weren't Mongolians, by looking at the different pottery. These ones lived in pit houses for the main part. All three of these cultures used stone tools, flint, and that sort of thing. They all had roads. And they all practiced irrigation, and some of those places, I mean, that's the only way they could survive, was to irrigate. There are still some traces of their irrigation, and I can't name the localities except up around, in between Tucson and Phoenix, Arizona. Now in the east, this gets a little bit confusing, so I'm going to try and just make it really, really simple. Along the Ohio rivers, the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, you're going to have cultures developing. And they're not necessarily one people, but it's one trade system. We know that by doing things like digging up their graves and finding the stuff that's in there. We can tell that connection. So you'll hear about specific cities, and I'll show you the name of one or two. But they were very diverse, and they traveled long distances in connection with each other. Probably didn't have any contacts with the Southwestern Indians. Ohio River Valley, you had what they called the Adena people, and you had this Hopewell tradition, which is nothing more than a trade connection. I'll tell you about one of those in Europe later on. One thing they did was they built large ceremonial mounds. They buried people in them. And when they buried people, they buried them with, their favorite possessions and things like that. So you could dig into there and find out, this guy's got a certain kind of rock that's not native to the area that he's buried in. That must mean someone brought it from somewhere else. And so you can establish the connections between them and others. The Adena culture ran from about 1,000 years BCE to about 200 BCE. And then they kind of faded away. And we don't know if they just all died out or whether they just splintered or what. But they're all over the area of Ohio, what's now Ohio, Indiana, West Virginia, Kentucky, even parts of Pennsylvania and New York. That Hopewell trade tradition we talked about, that's enough for it, except to show you this whole area on the map is covered by that trade network. It wasn't a formal network, it was just people that were in contact with each other. There's one place that down on the Mississippi Poverty Point that you can find traces of a large civilization, a large city. As we approach BCE, as we approach the time of the birth of Christ, you're going to see what some people call woodland cultures. Other people call them other things. Don't worry too much about it. I probably won't have anything on a test about it. But they developed all the way to the eastern coastline. And one of the easiest ways to identify them is that they spoke different language families. And you can kind of follow the language family where it developed. A lot of them in the Mississippi Valley, and in particular, there's one city you should probably remember. That might pop up on the test sometime. Might even be in your end of year thing for high school. It's a city called Cahokia on the Mississippi Valley, right across the Mississippi from St. Louis, from East St. Louis. Probably had a population of, let me see if I can get a population as many as 40,000. They also disappeared somewhere around in the middle of the 1300s. Don't worry about the slides I'm skipping. You can go back and look at them, but if I'm not talking about them, they won't fall in the body of knowledge you have to pass an exam. Of course, by the time that Europeans got here, Indians were scattered. That's not a politically correct term, is it, Mr. Hunt? Indians. I call them the American Indians. I don't call them the Native Americans, because all of us came here from somewhere else, including them. They were scattered all over by this time. And the only way you can identify maybe where they came from is by language. And some of them changed even after Europeans showed up. Two groups that I want to talk about, and it'll make sense to you later on. were people who spoke a language called Iroquoian or Iroquois dialect, whatever. One of the groups was a group related to the Huron tribe, and they were all around what is southern Ontario, along the Great Lakes. And there was another group speaking in more or less the same language that formed a group called the Iroquois League. They didn't like each other, and the Iroquois organized so that they could protect themselves against the Hurons, and so that the members of the Iroquois League, it's not one tribe, the members of the Iroquois League would stop fighting each other. Because most of these different clans, families, tribes, whatever you want to call it, fought over game, over territory, and things like that. And part of the rights of growing up was whether or not you fought. So that was just kind of part of their culture. Down below you have the Powhatans. Now these guys are related by language to people way up in where New England is now. They spoke another language family called Algonquian. We'll talk about the Powhatans. You've already heard that name before when you were watching Walt Disney cartoons, so we'll get into it. Let's go to Africa really fast. Two places, I guess, to remember, and maybe it'll become obvious why to remember. One's the Niger River, which is in the western part of Africa. The other one is the Congo River. We now spell it with a C, but back then everyone spelled it with a K. Over way far on the other side of the map, there's some other rivers. The longest river in the world bleeds into the Mediterranean, and that's the Nile, the Nile River. Here's some of the countries that were in Africa then, that were there that long ago. Ethiopia, Moina Mutapa, Mali, Songhai, Benin, Congo. Got that memorized? Next slide. What I want you to remember is the Africans had old traditions, old societies, no written history. They practiced slavery very early by, say, the year 650 AD or Common Era, whatever you want to call it nowadays in modern talk. They were mainly animists or polytheistic, but Islam started spreading down into the northern parts of Africa. They had great natural resources. They had plenty of people to use them. They had technology. Now, here's something. The Indians in the Americas didn't do any kind of metalwork. They had no iron, they had no steel or anything like that before Europeans showed up. In Africa, and I've seen the traces, I've visited the places, there are traces of kilns where they refined iron. So they were doing that maybe 1,500 years ago. So they didn't rely on old white man to show up and show them how to do it. They were already doing it. They were the first continent where Islam really spread. It came off the Arab Peninsula and started spreading through Africa. I'm not sure why I had the caliphates up there. Well, early African empires. Where this arrow is pointing, I don't know if you can see the arrow or not, but that's one of the caliphates that eventually dominated. Remember I said they dominated the Iberian Peninsula? That's one of those groups. After a few years, one caliphate would die out. Caliphate was ruled by a guy who was a direct descendant of Muhammad, or claimed to be. Now down south, African empires, you see a lot of them overlapping because one would spring up and then another one would eat it, kind of like a giant Pac-Man game. And a lot of these were still in existence in one form or another when the Europeans showed up. One of the reasons Europeans were interested, I told you, I think I just mentioned it, the Portuguese had noticed that the Arabs had a lot of gold and they were getting it from people coming across the Sahara. And that's kind of a map of the grid of trails across the Sahara Desert. And the Portuguese are going to start wanting to know, where does it come from? Why should we pay the Arabs for it? Why can't we cut out the middleman and get it ourselves? We don't need to look at the more modern countries we're not studying. There's the Nile River again. If you ever heard anyone tell you about Timbuktu, there it is, the highest point of the Nile, the most northern part of the not the Nile, of the Niger. There's good old Europe. In 1500, the year we're talking about. You see that place named as Spain? Officially, it wasn't Spain. Legally, it wasn't necessarily Spain until the 1700s. But everyone called it Spain by then. By the time Joanna the Mad passed it on to her son, everyone said it was Spain. You've got France, you've got Portugal, England is already there, Scotland, Ireland. You've got the Holy Roman Empire. Bits and pieces of that will turn into Austria, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, Holland. Interestingly enough, for maybe 100 or 150 years, the whole Holy Roman Empire was a very loosely organized one, made up of lots of little principalities. But basically, the Holy Roman Emperor was a member of one family, the Habsburg family. And that family also dominated Spain. So one family owned all that real estate. And the French spent all their time trying to fight over where the border was in between them and the Habsburgs. And before that, they'd all been part of one big empire under Charlemagne. The time we're talking about Europe, population, about 90 million. Counting England, Ireland, Scotland, and the Scandinavian. In the Americas, you could argue population 20 million, you could argue population 50 million, you could argue population 90 million, depending on who you want to believe. Because it's all a guess. And the only way you can figure it out is digging up ruins, looking at traces, archaeology, and also from the written accounts of the very first Europeans to show up there, what their observations were. In the Americas, the indigenous population, that's the people that were already there, their population plummeted after the Europeans. We're talking, if we'll accept the figure 50 million, we're talking they got down to about 4 million. And we'll talk about why in a while. You probably know. Conditions in Europe. Population growth. They've gone up in just 100 years or so from 70 million to 90 million. We talked about enclosure a little bit last time, I think, where as the country's central governments got more powerful, they took control of the land, and the people who've been on free land for years are off that land now, and they've got to find a place to get food. They start to gravitate towards the cities, towards the marketplaces. The marketplaces are growing because of international trade. The kings or the rulers all needed more money because they started having real armies and started having to be responsible for the countries they were controlling. There's going to be religious competition eventually. Strangely enough, some smart cookies are already making a lot of money out of the trade from China, the overland trade, and people start developing surpluses. Now, they didn't have a really good monetary system, so your surplus might be in goods, unless you could convert it to something with intrinsic value like gold or silver or something like that. And you could make your own gold coins. The coin was worth how much the gold was worth in the coin. But eventually, people are going to start building up a surplus. And somewhere along the line, let's say in the late 1400s, early 1500s, the people that had a lot of this are thinking, it's not doing me any good buried under my bed. How can I make my money make more money? And they're going to start getting together and kind of joint ventures. And that's another motivation for exploration. Because they want to find a way, they want to send a ship to China and come back. One shipload would be enough you could retire on that easily and be considered wealthy. The only thing is that, what if there's only a 50% chance of that ship getting back? So you've invested everything you own in that ship, and it goes down, too bad, you're in the breadline. So people figured out, let's share the risk. Probably in a, I don't know if they were drinking tea yet, but in some place like that, maybe in a pub, a few guys that had a little bit of surplus get together and say, how'd you like to share the risk on a ship? Still big profit. And this way, if the ship went down, you didn't lose everything you had. And so you get these joint venture companies starting to form up. And they were already starting in the beginning of the 1500s. Usually they had to have a charter from the king. Also, things that were changing, technology, the ability to navigate, that sort of thing. And this increased, ever-growing demand for trade, because once people got used to having these things, they wanted more. You're going to see some really strong central governments forming. Spain, although it's really 2 or 3 little kingdoms crammed together, they're together because Ferdinand and Isabella got married in 1469. France starts to develop a king who has strong central power. He still has a lot of competition from other people who are powerful, who have armies, what have you, but he will become increasingly powerful from about Louis XI onward. England will come under a family called the Tudors.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
Was Henry Tudor, we call him Henry VII of England. The Holy Roman Empire is pretty much under the Habsburgs. By the way, they get everything they get usually by marrying into it. You know, lovers rather than fighters. They get control of Holland, the lowlands, they get control of Spain that way. And then Russia is starting to develop from a city-state. And it will grow really fast. Okay, guys. I guess that's as far as we can go next time. If you haven't sent me in your book title that you want, do it. Friday's the deadline. And also, get that reading done, because I believe there's a quiz up there looking at you. And exams and quizzes. Okay. Anybody got questions? Send me an email. A message in Message Center, please. Sayonara, parting is such sweet sorrow. What play did that come from? Parting is such sweet sorrow.
I can't remember.
A rose by any other name is just as sweet. Came from the same play. William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Dahoka,
Your conference is now over. Goodbye.
You can watch us on internet. Dahoka's apparently